we have a broken system today when it comes to skills. And just to exemplify that, when you talk to anyone of governments, employers, education institutions, you hear very different answers as to what is the root cause of the youth unemployment situation that we see today. So when you talk to governments, they will often say, well, the problem is that employers just aren't creating enough jobs. And then when you talk to the employers, they then say, well, the problem is that educators just aren't producing the right skills. And then you go and you talk to the educators, and they say, well, just look back at business, because they think that we're supposed to be training automatically, and they're shirking on their training responsibilities. And so you come out of all these conversations, and I spend a lot of my time having conversations with all three, and it's little wonder that we have the dilemma that we have in the world today. And you find that young people and their parents are sort of sitting in the middle, in the eye of the storm, and don't know what to do. I mentioned that we spend, within McKinsey, we've done quite a lot of research around education to employment, and have at this point now looked at over 150 youth employment programs across 25 countries. We've surveyed about 18,000 young people, education providers, and employers across 16 countries. And there are three facts in particular that, in my mind, really shape the situation that we see today. Some of which came up in Brandon's research as well. The first is what I call the parallel universe problem, which is that when you ask young people, employers, and education providers to what extent are graduates ready for the job market, you'll find across the world somewhere between 30 to 50% of employers and young people saying that graduates are ready for the job market. When you talk to education providers, you'll find that over 75% of them will say that graduates are ready for the job market. And I'll say that the US education providers are the most optimistic of the global sample. They're at over 85%. So that's the first fact. The second is around return on investment. Roughly today, $250 billion is spent around the world by companies on training of new hires and existing employees. Less than 10% of CEOs can tell you what is the actual ROI of that spend. Third fact is that when you ask employers to what extent are you finding the skills that you want on the job market, literally 40% of employers, again, around the world, remarkable consistency, 40% of employers will say that they can't find the skills they need for even entry-level positions. So I mentioned at the outset that we've been looking at over 150 youth employment programs across 25 countries. And what we find consistently are that there are two things that we have not yet cracked as the world. And one is simply around scale. So there are many great youth employment programs around the world. But the reality is that they most often support hundreds of young people annually, sometimes thousands. Rarely do they get to the scale of hundreds of thousands, let alone millions of young people annually. And that actually is the magnitude of the challenge that we face in the world today. We have 75 million young people who are unemployed. We have 3 times as many who are underemployed. We need to be able to crack the scalability and replicability. And then second is, as I mentioned on the ROI, I mean, it's a data-free zone. It's not that there is negative evidence on the ROI for employers and young people to participate, but there is just no evidence. And so for that reason, we recently within McKinsey created an independent nonprofit, the McKinsey Social Initiative. And our very first program is called Generation. And so our goal with Generation is to try to address these two gaps around both scale and return on investment. And so our goal is to support 1 million young people to achieve jobs and skills across 5 countries in 5 years. And the countries are US, India, Kenya, Mexico, and Spain. And this is our first year of operation. We're now live in 10 cities across these 5 countries. And what we find as most important in being able to weave these 3 disparate groups together is that, one is a focus on middle skill jobs that are either high scarcity or high churn. And so, as an example, it could be pharmacy technicians, it could be digital marketers, it could be precision machinists. It could be certified nurse assistants. These are all middle skill jobs. But the key is high scarcity and high churn, because these are the ones that employers care about. Second, and then very much to work with employers to pre-guarantee job vacancies in those professions. Second is to then be able to deliver a program to skill young people in a very intensive and short duration. So our programs are somewhere between 8 to 12 weeks, varies based on the profession. And it's focused on what we call the breakdown moments that differentiate between high performers and low performers in a given role. So for example, you might do 30 activities over the course of your day as a web designer, but there are really only 4 or 5 of those activities that are true breakdown moments. And it's about identifying those and then anchoring the skills program around ensuring that you've got maximum exposure, repeat and intensive practice, so that by the time you get to the job, you are performing at peak productivity and quality outcomes. Once our young people come through the program, they are then able to interview for the pre-guaranteed job vacancies, and that's when the measurement of the ROI begins. So essentially, from day one on the job, how are you performing on productivity and quality relative to non-generation hires? What happens in terms of retention? What happens in terms of your speed to promotion? And then for the young person, we look at their personal and financial well-being, and Gallup's been very helpful on this in that we're trying to understand to what extent are young people able to afford a car, buy a home, what's happening in terms of their optimism, their engagement with their family, ultimately with their healthcare outcomes as well. And so this is our first year, but I'll just share some of the findings thus far, and I'll share from 2 countries. So if I start with Kenya, so our young people, they hold a secondary school degree. They do not have any post-secondary degrees in terms of universities, etc. Their grade point average in secondary school is roughly a C GPA, in some cases lower. And we were training them in roles for sales for banks and insurance companies. So first of all, we've had about now 230 young people go through the program in the pilot form. So on graduation day, 100% of them had employment. 2/3 of them had received offers from multiple employers. If you compare that to what banks typically hire, so the banks typically only extend offers to 10% of the young people that they interview, the vast majority of whom have university degrees. Second metric is if you actually then look at what happens in terms of their attrition. So by the end of month 3, typically in the industry, 35% of young people will have dropped out. In our case, at the end of month 3, less than 8% had dropped out. If you look at sales data, we're still in the process of gathering this, but for some of the institutions, it is at least twice to 3 times in terms of the sales generated by the generation hires relative to their peers. So this is all to say that we can actually now begin to draw a line between what is a win for employers and a win for young people. And it's about changing that equation, which in my mind is the most important thing we have to do to be able to make these types of interventions much more systemic. Unless there is clear evidence on ROI, we will never have employers investing at the scale which we want. We will never be able to convince young people or their parents of the value of being in these kinds of programs. And that's very much the journey that we hope to be able to continue as Generation expands, and that we hope to be able to share with the community. Because we have learned a tremendous amount from the youth employment programs that play such an important part in many parts of the world. And we hope to also be able to give back. Thank you.